Good afternoon. My name is Tina Kepi, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series. Lectures are held on the third Thursday of every month on the third floor of the City County Building in Lincoln. A detailed schedule for this series is available on our website. You can also learn more about our programs and services at nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television and on our YouTube webpage. Today's speaker is Mike Babcock, author of Nebraska Football Vault, The History of the Cornhuskers. Mike Babcock has covered Nebraska athletics for 37 years, the first 17 as a beat writer and then columnist for the Lincoln Journal-Star. He is no stranger to magazines, writing for Nebraska, Inside Cornhusker Sports, and Huskers Illustrated. He has written and edited a dozen books about the Huskers and is also the editor of Hail Varsity. Please join me in welcoming Mike Babcock.
Thanks. As I said earlier, I told some people earlier I'm a writer, not a speaker, and that may be the one thing that I convince you of. When you leave here, you'll say, you know what, he did convince me of that. He wasn't a speaker. The mention of the Husker, Tina mentioned the Husker Vault. I'll tell you a quick story about that. The Husker Vault, which is one of the cooler books that I've been involved with, and I've been involved with probably about a dozen books, all of them Nebraska football related, except for one, Nebraska basketball, which was kind of my passion. And when I left the newspaper, I did a book on Nebraska basketball history. It's not very well edited, but I think if you can find it now, you can get it for about 50 cents. But that was, you know, as I said, that was my passion, Nebraska basketball. But the Husker Vault is this really cool book, and it came out a couple of years ago. And I was contacted by the publisher who said that we're going to have a book signing in Omaha at Costco. And would I be willing to do that? And I said, yeah, I would be. What else? Who else were they going to have there to draw people in? And he said that they would have Tommy Fraser would come and he would also sign. So it would be Tommy and I would be the people signing the book. So my wife, Barb, and I drove up to Omaha. Costco, it's on West Dodge there, and had never been in a Costco before. We walk in and I don't know where anything is, and I asked somebody where the book signing was, and the lady pointed me to the back, and so Barb and I walked towards the back, and they had a big table set up there with books, and there was already a line forming for this signing thing. And there was a young lady there that was kind of responsible for it. So I walked up to her and I said, "We're here for the book signing." And she said, "The line is right there. Thanks for coming." And my wife laughed about that. And I said, "No, actually I'm one of the people who are going to be signing the book." So she said, "Oh, I'm very sorry." She was very apologetic. And I said, "No, really, that's fine. Not a problem." So Tommy Fraser showed up a little bit later, and I said to Tommy, now when people come through, we were going to sit at a table. When people come through, you be first, and then I'll sit next to you, because people are going to want your signature on this book. I might be in a position where I'm defacing private property when I sign it. So we sit down, and there were 2 or 3 people early on came through there, and Tommy signed it, and he said, he said, "Mike is the person that wrote it, and you want his signature." And they said, "No, thanks, that's fine." I've got, so, I learned a lot long before this, don't take yourself too seriously. Take what you do very seriously, but don't take yourself all that seriously. And it was a lesson that I learned early on. I'm going to talk a little bit about jumbo steam. So we're going back 100 years here, but also as a kind of a lead in here, a couple of other things I learned when I was at the newspaper. I thought I had the best job anybody could have. If I could live anywhere I wanted to live, it'd be in southeast Nebraska, and if I could do anything I wanted to do, it'd be what I've done for the last 37 years. starting at the newspaper. But I learned at the newspaper early on that no matter the subject that I wrote about, there was always somebody out there that would read the newspaper that knew more about that subject than I did. And you know, I think that's a good thing. You know, I didn't think that I knew everything. And I want to put that in what I have to say today in context. You know, I may talk about some things you may know more about it than I do. But I've done a little bit of research. I always say I like to write about the history of Husker football so far back that there's nobody around that can dispute what I say. And we're kind of getting into that time frame with Jumbo Steam. But the other humility thing, and I want to tell Tom, I got lots of Tom Osborne stories because I have great respect for Tom Osborne, but early on when I was at the Journal and Star, I worked with Randy York, who's a very good friend of mine and a definitive sports writer. He works for the university now, Huskers.com. And we had a lady that worked at the Journal and Star, Jan Sack, and she laid out the special editions, and it was just a wonderful person. And Jan had a stroke, and it pretty much incapacitated her. But she and Nancy Osborne had gone to college together. Nancy knew her very well, and made sure that Jan got to all the Husker football games, the home games. And Randy was kind of the person that made sure that Jan got down to the stadium, and then Nancy would meet Randy and Jan, and she would take it over from there. Well, Randy had something came up, and he couldn't do it on a particular game, and so he said, would you be willing to take Jan Sack down to the stadium so that Nancy can meet her and take her to the seats? And I said, you know, I'd be glad to do that. And he said, well, you need to call Nancy on Friday afternoon and let her know that you're going to be bringing Jan, that I'm not going to be doing it. And I said, okay, that's fine. So it's Friday afternoon, and I call the Osborne residence, and Tom answers. And I had tremendous respect for Tom Osborne before I even started at the newspaper because I grew up in the state. But Tom answers the phone. And my reaction is, I said, is Nancy there? Not, hello, Tom, hi, Coach, anything like that. Is Nancy there? Yeah, just a second. And so Nancy gets on the phone. And my first question to her was that Tom? Now, I mean, who else would it have been? In defense of myself, it was a Friday afternoon, and I figured Tom would be preparing for Colorado or whoever at the office, and he happened to be home at that point. So when I said that, I immediately realized this whole thing had degenerated, my ability to handle this, and so it was very quick. I said to Nancy, I'll bring Jan Sack down to the stadium tomorrow. We'll meet you at such and such a time. Thanks. And I hung up. And I thought, after that, I had this image of Tom saying, was that Mike Babcock? I wonder why he didn't say hi, And I was, so again, humility was something that I had tremendous, I've had several opportunities to be very humble in my approach. And again, not taking myself too seriously, but taking what I do very seriously. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Jumbo Steam here because of the State Historical Society, and I think this is really cool. And Jumbo Steam's final season as Nebraska's coach was 1915, so there's 100 years there. And I've done a lot of research on Jumbo Steam. He was called Jumbo Steam because he had big feet. He was 6'4". He was a big man, but he had big feet. I learned that from reading the student yearbook. That's where he got the nickname, is E.O. Jumbo Steam. Ewald was his first name. Jumbo was hired in 1911, and you have to figure Nebraska football began in 1890, as you probably know. 1891 was the first time that Nebraska played an opponent from outside the state, played Iowa. Nebraska actually played 4 games that year, 3 of them against Doane. but in preparation to play Iowa. And this is where history gets a little confusing for me. The Nebraska Media Guide for a long time pointed this out, and Frederick Ware, who wrote a definitive history of Nebraska football in 1940, called 50 Years of Football, and he covered those first 50 years. And it's a tremendous, it's not a very big book, and it's difficult to find this thing. It's basically a paper-bound book, and the one I have is falling apart. But I couldn't remember this quote, so I wrote it down. This is the last game of that season, 1891, getting ready to play Iowa after the 3 games with Doane, 2 of which Nebraska won. And apparently there was a professor at the university that hooked Nebraska up with a coach. The term coach was a little bit nebulous then, but T.U. Lyman Theron was his first name. And Frederick Ware wrote in this history that the professor at the university had come to the rescue of Nebraska, had quoted the student newspaper as saying that through him, the club probably will be able to secure the services of Captain T.U. Lyman, a Yale man, and that was always a big thing. You know, if you were from the East at that point, that's where football began, and you needed those coaches from the East. A Yale man who understands the great college game thoroughly. And he was going to prepare Nebraska to play Iowa. Okay, so Frederick Ware himself writes, Captain Lyman was the coach of the State University of Iowa team, the Nebraskans' next opponent. The explanation was simple. Iowa wanted a good contest and lent its teacher in an effort to ensure a good game. So this is great sportsmanship here, that Iowa had lent Nebraska its coach. And so I went back and I was reading a history of Iowa football because I thought this was remarkable, that Iowa would lend Nebraska its coach to prepare for a game against Iowa, which Iowa won, incidentally, 22-0. And I found out that T.U. Lyman was actually a player the previous 2 seasons at Iowa College, which I believe was in Grinnell, Iowa. It was Iowa's big rival. So that T.U. Lyman wasn't the coach of the University of Iowa that Nebraska was going to play. He was, in fact, a former player of Iowa's bitter rival. And it made very much sense that he would prepare Nebraska. Didn't prepare him very well if they lost 22-0. But so that was carried down from, Frederick Ware had written that. The Nebraska Media Guide had a little note in there about that for several years. Now if you look at the media guide, that's been changed because I come across these things and I'm kind of a nag. I'm sure that doesn't matter a whole lot to too many people, but I always thought that was interesting. And so I'm in an area where I'm kind of wondering sometimes when I look up these things and I carry things that have been printed or reported in the past. I probably repeated some of these things. That's one thing I never repeated, but I did see a documentary film once in which someone says, whoa, what a sporting gesture on the part of the University of Iowa to allow their coach to come there. No, it didn't happen that way. Okay, so we know that Nebraska had its first paid coach in 1894. That was a guy named Frank Crawford. He was, by all accounts, a racist. He was paid approximately $500, which might have been a tuition waiver also. He coached for 2 years before leaving. George Flippin, the first African-American football player at Nebraska, was voted captain by his teammates, and Frank Crawford wouldn't allow him to be captain. The fact that he was paid $500, which included tuition waiver, basically bankrupted the athletic program, and so the students had to raise money to try to pay off what he was owed. But in 1894, his second year as coach, Nebraska defeated Iowa 36-0 at the end of the season. That was a big win for Nebraska. And there was a writer for the student newspaper, and actually I think he was something to do with the arts or whatever, but he fell into disfavor, so he got assigned to write a story about this football game, which was not it wasn't something he necessarily wanted to do, and I don't think that it was anything that most people felt like athletics was a far cry from being able to write about the arts or something like that. But Nebraska wins the game 36-0, and he wrote after that, "We have met the Cornhuskers and they are ours," referring to the Iowa team. Okay, so now we jump forward to 1900 and Cy Sherman. Cornhuskers is a derogatory term in 1894 in this story. Cy Sherman, in conjunction with a journalism professor at the university also, accomplished the task of getting Cornhuskers to be Nebraska's nickname officially. So it had gone from something derogatory six years earlier to something that we all appreciate from 1900 on. That was also about the time that Nebraska's colors became scarlet and cream. Prior to that, it was gold. And there were references to the old Gold Knights. And you've probably heard references to Nebraska, the Bug Eaters. That's one thing that I've never found an original reference in newspapers. I've never found that. I've only found that in history books looking back on that. It seems like kind of an odd nickname. Actually, the essence of it, and again, I've never seen an original reference to it, but the reference was supposedly these people were so tough. If they had to eat bugs to survive, they would. And that's how hardy the people were. And there had been a drought in the Midwest in this area, and so it wasn't necessarily a derogatory term. It was more of a, this is how tough these people are. They would eat bugs to survive if that's what they had to do. Not a very engaging title though. So Cornhuskers is probably a little bit better than that. But so we're by the time Jumbo Steam is hired, Nebraska is now the Cornhuskers. It's scarlet and cream. One of the things that I think one of the great things that's been done about Nebraska football history is Husker Century, the 3-part series that was on NET. Tremendous series. And rest his soul, Jeff Schmall was one of the people that I talked to initially about putting that together. I think he was one of the driving forces behind that. And the original idea was that they were going to do, it was going to be a couple of hours, maybe a 2-hour deal. And he said, we could deal with the history prior to Bob Devaney in about 15 minutes, and then the other hour and 45 would be post-Devaney. And I said, no, really, if you look back, the passion for Nebraska football predated Bob Devaney. Bob Devaney resurrected something that had already been there. If you look at the DX Bible years, you look at Biff Jones. Biff Jones took Nebraska to the Rose Bowl in 1941, 41 Rose Bowl. And, Bob Devaney always said, the passion was for Nebraska football was such that he'd been here a couple of years before he found out Nebraska had lost that game to Stanford. People were so excited about going to the Rose Bowl. So there was history before that, and so we're going to go back to 1911 again, Jumbo Steam. And by that point, Nebraska had had some success. He was preceded by Bummy Booth was the coach from 1900 to 1905. Bummy's teams won 46 games, lost 8, tied 3. Didn't have much success against Minnesota. That was always a sticking point. Couldn't do well against Minnesota, but Bummy Booth basically was forced out because people weren't happy. They weren't, they were winning games, and he had this remarkable record, 46-8 over 5 years with 3 ties, but they weren't quite what the fans expected because they weren't winning the right games. It was like, so he was kind of pushed out. I think he left I think the story was he left to practice law. It was another story that he didn't leave to practice law. He left for something else, but it's one of those stories that gets passed down. But he had success. He was succeeded by a guy named Amos Foster, who was here 1 year and took off. His team was 6-4, and Foster was replaced by a guy, King Cole. His nickname was King, William Cowles Cole, and he had good teams. He was here for 4 years. And so his last season was 1910. Now we're getting to jumbo steam here. In 1907, Nebraska joined a conference finally. And Nebraska always wanted to be in the Western Conference, which became the Big Ten. And Nebraska had applied for membership in 1900 and been rejected. And there's some confusion again in Frederick Ware's book whether Nebraska applied again in 1911 or not and was again rejected. But that was how, as the oldest conference in the country. In 1911, there were 8 members of it. And it was the Western Conference. In some references, it was just referred to as the conference because it was the oldest. And Nebraska thought it belonged in that conference, but I never had the opportunity, never got in there, but it tried, petitioned. So Nebraska joins Missouri, Kansas, Washington, St. Louis, and Iowa in forming the Missouri Valley Intercollegiate Athletic Association. And Iowa is also a member of the Western Conference. Iowa had dual membership for a while. So Nebraska is now a member of a conference. And the next year, 1908, the conference added Drake and the Iowa Agricultural College, so Iowa State, the Iowa Aggies. And so in 1911, that's the way the conference looked with those teams. Iowa had, in 1911, Iowa left the Missouri Valley single membership, so it was only a Western Conference team at that point. And actually, if you looked at the old the facade on the east side of Memorial Stadium before they did the big expansion there, if you look up there at the logo or the crests or whatever along there, still you would see Grinnell, which joined the conference in 1919, and I think Drake is still there. I think you can see that facade. If you go inside the new thing, you can still see the old facade there. And I think Washington and St. Louis is up there, and probably says Iowa Aggies and Kansas Aggies by that point. I think Kansas State had also joined. So Nebraska's in a conference. All right, so we've got King Cole. He'd been the coach. He'd been fairly successful, but the Missouri Valley Intercollegiate Athletic Conference established a rule whereby each school had to have a full-time paid coach. So it's a year-round deal. That's a job, and you're going to be part of the faculty. And Cole had other things going for him, and he had no interest in being a full-time coach, plus the fact that he had taken some criticism because his record against Minnesota was 0-3-1, and Minnesota was in the conference, the Western Conference. You should beat those teams. So Cole decided he didn't want the job. He didn't want a full time. He didn't want to be part of the faculty or whatever. So Nebraska went looking for a coach. Depending upon the newspaper accounts, there were 30 to 50 people applied. It's uncertain the number. The number was narrowed to 6 or 7. Again, there was uncertainty to that. Three of them were interviewed, including Jumbo Steam, who was the athletic director and coach at Ripon College. He was from Wisconsin, Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. He'd been a high school coach for 3 years while he was finishing his degree at the University of Wisconsin. Had actually played basketball and football at Wisconsin and had played against Nebraska in basketball in 1908 and scored 28 points against Nebraska in a 43-3 victory against the Huskers. So not a real good basketball season there for the Huskers. So Jumbo Steam is one of the people that applies for the job. One of the things that Nebraska wanted in a coach, one of the coaches that Nebraska interviewed was a Yale man, and again, Eastern football was a big thing, but at this point, Nebraska wanted somebody with Western Conference experience or Western style football. And the game had changed a little bit in 1908. Prior to that, not too much before that, if Teddy Roosevelt hadn't stepped in, football would have probably been banned because there were so many people getting injured. It was like a gang fight. And if you look at some of those pictures of those early football teams, they look like axe murderers. I mean, these guys you had to be pretty tough to play the game. So Nebraska wanted somebody from Western experience, and apparently they thought Ripon College counted because they hired Jumbo's team, and he was 25 years old when he coached his first game at Nebraska. Nebraska at that point played on Nebraska Field, which was built in 1909. It held about 8,000 people, and roughly, if you south of Memorial Stadium now, it was south of Memorial Stadium, and in the general area of where the old practice field used to be. When I first came to games, you know, you had the big fence there, and there was the practice field, and then there was the bleachers for the knothole section, and kids would scale the fence and try to run across the field, and not, you know, figuring that you can't stop everybody and kind of thing. So Nebraska Field was roughly in that area. It might have been a little, not exactly there, but it was in that general area, and it ran east and west. And there's some dispute about this, but on the north side, I believe it was a covered grandstand. It was a wooden stadium. And it was built through the efforts of a guy named Earl Eager, who had played for Bummy Booth in the early 1900s. And Earl was 150 pounds, and his nickname was Dog. I'm not sure exactly why this was, except that he was 150 pounds. And at that point, the rules, these are the kind of rules that had to be changed to make it a little safer. You could actually pick up a guy and throw him over the goal line for a touchdown. I think it was worth 5 points. And there are accounts in newspapers where Dog, that's one of the things that they could do with him, is they'd pick him up and throw him in the end zone. And if you look at some of those pictures, they weren't exactly jerseys, but whatever it was they wore over the top sometimes had actually had handles sewn on the deal, so you could pick a guy up and throw him. Okay, so Earl Eager, after he finished his playing career at Nebraska, or he got his degree, he became the business manager. I think in some ways he was kind of the athletic department business manager, but he probably had other responsibilities. But he thought that Nebraska needed to have a field to replace where they had been playing, which I'm not exactly sure. It was on the north part of campus also, and they literally had to walk that field and throw away the rocks and broken bottles or whatever to play on that thing. So Dog Eager got the stadium built. Construction began in 1908. Nebraska played its games at M Street Park, which is not too far from Lincoln High, where Lincoln High is now, while the stadium was being finished. And played the first game there in 1909. It wasn't the first game of the season, but the first game they played there was in 1909. So Nebraska has a field, has a nickname, has school colors. I mean, it's had some success. Can't beat Minnesota. That's a problem that needs to be addressed. And Jumbo Steam is hired as coach. Jumbo had apparently, by all accounts, again, he was 6'4". He was taller than any of his players and probably bigger than most of his players. According to accounts, he was a very dictatorial guy. I read an account in the student yearbook, the Cornhusker, which had the name Cornhusker at that point. The sports editor of the student newspaper had, when Steam came there, had tried to use his name with a pun, you know, that the Huskers would really go with the steam behind them. And apparently, again, this is an account in the yearbook, apparently Jumbo didn't appreciate his name being used as a pun to make things go. So the account said that he went to the newspaper office and apparently ripped into this guy, which made me think possibly of Bo Pelini and some reporters that had said some things about Taylor Martinez. There was kind of a issue there at one point. But it was such a difficult situation for this young man, the sports editor of the newspaper, that he resigned. So apparently Jumbo had a temper. And the accounts indicate that those who played for him rarely came out of games. They were tough guys. They held their position as best they could. They didn't relinquish it very much. He didn't use a lot of players in games. He expected guys to play through injuries, and they did. And they had the nickname Steamroller. And apparently, I guess he didn't go after the regular newspapers, because I think that term occasionally was applied to his team, Steamrollers. That's how tough they were. And go back a little bit, but his record over 5 seasons as Nebraska's coach was 35-2-3. It remains the best coaching record by percentage, obviously, at Nebraska ever. His teams lost 1 game in 1911 and tied 2. The 1 loss was to Minnesota. The 2 ties were to Iowa, Agricultural, and Michigan, which had just been dumped from the Western Conference that year. 6-6 ties. His second year, he lost 1 game. His teams lost to Minnesota. So now the only other tie occurred in 1914, but I want to go to 1913. So Nebraska has had this success now. Nebraska has the loss to Minnesota in 1912 was at Minnesota. And Jumbo Steam, during that game, apparently, had his assistant coach, I don't think he had multiple assistants, was Owen Frank, who had played for him in 1911 and was assisting him in 1912. And he had Owen Frank take photographs of Minnesota's shift. Minnesota had a shift. Herb Williams was the coach. Dr. Herb Williams was the coach. And Minnesota was a power. And so Jumbo had Owen Frank take photographs of the Minnesota shift in 1912 when Nebraska lost to them. Lots of photographs. And use those photographs in preparation to play Minnesota in 1913. Another thing that Jumbo instituted, and people think that some of this stuff is new, it's not. Bummy Booth had established basically a team dormitory. It was a Windsor Hotel. The team stayed at the Windsor Hotel in 1905. He also established a preseason practice. He took the team to the University State Fisheries, I believe they were in South Bend at that point, and had preseason practice. So Jumbo Steam in 1913 has spring practice for the first time. Nebraska had never had that. He establishes a spring practice in preparation. So he's got the spring practice, and the student yearbook said that obviously the results showed. He has the photographs of the Minnesota game, and Nebraska beats Minnesota in 1913, 7-0 in Lincoln. And it was such a big, this was such a big accomplishment to beat Minnesota, because the second time that Nebraska had done it, that the students went marching downtown, the band and the cheerleaders or whatever, and it grew to such a point that they were marching through theaters downtown, and there were a couple of hotels, and they knocked out a plate glass window, and a few more students built a bonfire at the football field. And according to newspaper accounts, students were taking things from private property. Somebody took a rocking chair off a porch of a house near there and threw it in the bonfire, and somebody else pulled down parts of a fence from somebody's private property and threw it in the bonfire. I mean, people were going crazy. A guy named Beck, Gordon Beck, had scored the touchdown, the winning touchdown, the only touchdown. Nebraska took some dirt from the end zone and put it in a trophy case, and that remained there. When Frederick Ware wrote the history in 1940, he said that only in recent years had someone absconded with the dirt and they couldn't find it. But apparently it had been there for a long time. So it was a big deal to beat Minnesota, 1913. So now Nebraska is undefeated in 1913, and I believe at that point had won, counting going back to 1912, the loss to Minnesota. Nebraska had won 14 games in a row. So now we're going into 1914 with a 14-game winning streak. Nebraska's second game, I believe it was the second game of the 1914 season, is against South Dakota. And Nebraska, it's a tie, scoreless tie. And again, the student yearbook said that accused South Dakota of having gone somewhere in Wisconsin in late August and spent 6 weeks preparing for this game against Nebraska, and that Wisconsin had used players who would have been 6th and 7th year students at the school to accomplish this tie. So Nebraska gets tied in 1914, wins the rest of the games. So now you go into 1915, and Nebraska wins every game, 8-0. The final game is a 52-7 victory against Iowa. And Nebraska didn't play Minnesota that year because Dr. Herb Williams was so upset by that loss in 1913 that they quit playing Nebraska. If you look back, every year Nebraska played Minnesota every year from 1900 to 1913, except there was 1 year in there where they didn't play. After the 1913 loss, when Williams was so upset about that loss, Nebraska played Minnesota in 1919, and then didn't play Minnesota on a regular basis until the 30s. That's how upset Herb Williams was about this loss. So 8-0 in 1915. At the end of the season, the Rose Bowl, which had been played once, so this would have been the second Rose Bowl, considers Nebraska among 3 schools to play in the second Rose Bowl. And the athletic board meets and says, we won't play in the Rose Bowl because that would put too much emphasis on athletics. And we don't want to do it. So Nebraska didn't have the opportunity to play in the Rose Bowl. Cy Sherman, who's the sports editor of the Lincoln Star, I think at this point, writes a lengthy column saying Nebraska should be national champions this year, because he compared by scores. It was sort of a weak argument, I think, but according to Cy Sherman, who was a prestigious, actually much later, Cy Sherman was one of the people that was involved in establishing the Associated Press ratings. He and a guy from the Des Moines Register and there are a couple other people were very instrumental in establishing those ratings. But so Cy Sherman says we need to acknowledge that Nebraska is the best team in the nation and would have been successful against any team, 8-0. So at this point now, Jumbo Steam's teams have gone 29 games without a loss, and they had the one tie in there against South Dakota. So now we've got, there's some thought that maybe Jumbo might be interested in going to Wisconsin because that's where he's from. There's a little speculation about that. Turns out that wasn't Wisconsin, but Indiana contacts him. At that point, he's making $3,500 a year, which he's pretty well paid. Actually, when I told my wife I was going to do this and we were going to talk about Jumbo, we drove down past 2121 Sheridan, which is where Jumbo's team lived in 1915. Now there's a house still there. I'm sure it's maybe changed a little bit, but I thought that was interesting. So we drive by that. He's getting paid $3,500, and Indiana says we'll pay you $4,500 to come to Indiana and be the athletic director and football coach. Now at Nebraska, he also coached basketball and had very good teams. I think his teams in 3 years were 52-16, or maybe I'm missing that by a couple, but not much, and won 3 Missouri Valley Conference championships in basketball. And his teams had won or shared every Missouri Valley Conference title in the 5 years that he coached the football team. So Indiana comes in and says, we'll pay you $4,500 to be athletic director and football coach. He wouldn't be coaching basketball there. So he talks to he has a gentleman's agreement, according to the newspaper accounts, to remain at Nebraska until 1917. There's nothing written. He doesn't have a contract, but he has a gentleman's agreement. So the University of Nebraska lets him out of the we'll waive this gentleman's agreement. You don't have to stay. He said he would stay at Nebraska for $42.50 if they would pay him $4,250. He would stick around. Okay, now, so we've got Nebraska Field, and it seats 8,000 people. In 1915, when now Minnesota has dropped him, doesn't want to play him anymore because take their football and go home because he lost that game in 1913. Jumbo Steam replaces Minnesota on the schedule with Notre Dame. And in 1915, one of Nebraska's victories is a 20-19 victory over Notre Dame. And that's a big deal. Notre Dame is a big deal in 1915 even. Jess Harper's the coach. Newt Rockne is the assistant coach. When Nebraska plays them, Newt Rockne scouts Nebraska, comes back with his scouting report. Guy Chamberlain is the star player for Nebraska. Guy Chamberlain scored 16 touchdowns, I think in 1915, maybe 1914, one of those 2 years, after Nebraska lured him away from Nebraska Wesleyan. In his first 2 years, he was at Nebraska Wesleyan, and Nebraska convinced him to transfer to Nebraska. He had to sit out a year, 1913. The rules, same kind of a thing. He had to sit out a year. But Nebraska beats Notre Dame 20-19. That game drew 8,000, and at one end, at the east end of the Nebraska field, was a big coal pile. It was the power plant. University power plant had a coal pile. So for a lot of football games, people would climb up on the coal pile and watch the game for free, which would increase the attendance. And apparently, kids would climb up into trees, anything, to see the game. The Notre Dame game, again, according to newspaper accounts, netted Nebraska almost $12,000 in revenue from the one game. The revenue for football at the end of the 1915 season was $35,000. Okay, so Jumbo Steam wants $42.50. It's easily covered. But the faculty steps in and says, no, this is not a good idea. You shouldn't be paying. The only person that's going to be paid more than him is the chancellor, Samuel Avery, and we can't have that. It's too much emphasis on athletics, where we can't pay that. So the business people in town, football's a big thing at this point. Business people said, you know what, we'll cover the difference. We'll get the $750 or whatever it takes to keep him there. So that puts the faculty even more. No, we can't have outside influences. This is not going to happen. So Nebraska doesn't offer him enough money. He takes the job at Indiana. He accepts the job at Indiana. It becomes a very acrimonious separation because he also takes with him Dick Rutherford, who had played for him. Rutherford was a halfback and an outstanding player from Beatrice. And Nebraska wanted to consider him as a coach, head coach, I think. But he goes with Jumbo to Indiana. So there's a lot of acrimonious, there are letters exchanged between Jumbo and the University of Nebraska, and he finally gives Rutherford his release from Indiana because the University of Nebraska said it would pay him $2,500 to be an assistant coach if he came back. So Jumbo said, well, his opportunity to make $2,500, I won't stand in his way. I'll let Rutherford come back. Rutherford came back, coached 1 year as an assistant, and then I believe he left and maybe coached somewhere else. But it was not a good separation for Jumbo. So he goes to Indiana, and after that, I guess Husker fans, we don't care a whole lot about what happened there, but he didn't have a lot of success at Indiana. His best seasons, I think he was 5-2 a couple of seasons. His record was barely winning over a brief period of time. But after the 1921 season, he stepped aside from coaching for health reasons. The New York Times reported that he had gone to Rochester, Minnesota, which I assume was either the Mayo Clinic or the predecessor or whatever, had some sort of operation, and a story in October of 1922 indicated that he had stomach problems and had this surgery and was in a wheelchair. And then the next reference, again in the New York Times, was his obituary. He died at age 37. Again, it was not specific what the cause was. I assume it was a cancer or something like that. So it was kind of a sad ending. But if you look at the body of work, he had tremendous success. Beat Minnesota, that was right there. That was a big deal. And the reason I wanted to talk about him, not the 100 years, but I have a quote here from Frederick Ware. He said during the time, and again, Ware is, writing this in 1940. He did the history with Greg McBride, who is another legendary figure. But Ware wrote, under Jumbo's team, the team became not only a university but a statewide institution, and the dream of being a Cornhusker became a part of life of high school football players over the state. And there were about 80-some high schools that played football at that time. Ware described Steam as Nebraska's first master of offensive tactics. The forward pass was established in 1908, and apparently Steam's teams did a lot of the misdirection and passes and double passes and all kinds of things, which earlier Bummy Booth had been criticized for. Too much deception. You have to be, the game was rougher then. And Ware wrote, again in 1940, Cornhusker football today is fundamentally the football of the steamroller era. Most important change has been simply gravity of numbers comprising squads, of numbers comprising the paid attendance and the newspaper gallery and the radio audience. Excuse me. One of the things that had been talked about in 1915, and there, I mentioned earlier, membership in the Western Conference. It's unclear whether Nebraska applied in 1915 or not. It did either in 1911 or 1915. Again, you read Ware, it's not exactly clear, and I've seen references both ways. But there's still this feeling that Nebraska belongs in that. Also in 1915, there was talk in the student newspaper and on campus of building a concrete and steel stadium. You needed something to replace Nebraska Field. As soon as Jumbo took the job at Indiana, that talk ended. And they put some bleachers in at Nebraska Field. They tried to expand it a little bit with bleachers. And by 1922, when the last game was played there, I believe that was against Notre Dame also. I think the attendance was listed at about 15,000. So they bumped it up a bunch, and could have been people standing there too. But originally, Nebraska Field was 8,000. So Memorial Stadium might have been what became the focus of the camp. Might have happened a lot sooner had Jumbo stayed, because there was talk of that. That's how much passion there was. The Notre Dame series continued into the 20s, and then you probably know the story there because of the Klan and the way people responded to Notre Dame. It wasn't the greatest response that Notre Dame got from Husker fans. I don't know that they had the best fans in the world go through these gates sign necessarily there then. I know that in 1914, towards the end of Steam's tenure, I don't know whether it was through the chancellor's efforts or whose efforts it was, but they set off a separate section for women that came to Nebraska Field. And I think I have a comment here as to why they did that. Basically, it was, maybe I didn't have that, but, oh yeah, here it is. Samuel Avery was actually quoted. This gave the boys an opportunity to express their opinion of the referee and opposing players. So the ladies could sit in had their own section at Nebraska Field, and the boys could offer their opinion of the opposing players and the officials. So, Jumbo's team, I'll say one more thing about him, and I think, I don't know if this had to do with the acrimony or whatever, but he said that he indicated that he would stick around and coach basketball in 1916 before he went to Indiana. You know, he wouldn't report to Indiana until September of that year. And so he coached Nebraska's first game in 1916. It was against Nebraska Wesleyan, and Nebraska lost by 1 point in overtime. The thing that's interesting to me about this is that the Nebraska Basketball Media Guide has Nebraska's record in 1916 as 13-1. And the first game that it has listed is against Kansas, back-to-back games against Kansas. I have the newspaper account of the game played on January 8th, 1916 against Nebraska Wesleyan, a 1 point loss in overtime. And Jumbo's team was coaching the team. But apparently it's been lost to history because if you look in the media guide, it's not there. And Nebraska's 13-1 record, the one loss was in a rematch to Wesleyan. And the student newspaper said, well, that wasn't a big deal, these two. The student newspaper and the yearbook both referred to two losses to Wesleyan that year. I guess it was the yearbook said that, well, it wasn't that big a deal because Nebraska Wesleyan didn't observe the intercollegiate rules the way it should, so it didn't matter, those two losses. The gentleman who coached the team in 1916 after Jumbo's one game, which isn't included in his career record either, he had played as a freshman at Nebraska, and then I don't know whether he left the university, but he was a referee. He had done some refereeing. Sam Wall was his name. He was 13-1 that year. He was just kind of an interim coach, and then he was, the next year, Nebraska hired a replacement for Steam, who was Doc Stewart, who came from Oregon State, and Doc Stewart coached basketball and football because that's the way it was set up. That's what he was being paid to do. So Doc Stewart was here for a couple of years, and then he took off. And another point of history, it said that he was called into military service, and so he left and never came back. In fact, he did come back and coach the basketball team that next year. The newspaper account says he was called into service with the YMCA. I don't know exactly how that worked, but he did come back, coach one season of basketball, and then he left Nebraska. So what I'm saying, I guess, is I've researched this stuff. I've probably told you stuff that isn't even accurate because we've got that thing with T.U. Lyman, this things that get carried down. I've always tried to find original sources on these things, and that's why I mentioned the bug eaters earlier. I've never seen any account from an original source, from a newspaper account, where they were referred to as bug eaters, only after the fact. So that's about the size of it. I should have something clever to say at the end, but I don't. I thought about telling the story. I've told this a million times, the story about falling down in front of Tom Osborne's car, but I think anybody that's ever seen me has probably heard that story. So now I guess are we to ask if there are any questions or threats or anything like that. I guess we have some time for that. I'd be happy to, yeah, sure.
Will we meet the four horsemen?
Beat the Four Horsemen, yes.
Big Red Grange.
Yes, yep. Well, now, there's an interesting story about Grange. The question was, did Nebraska beat the Four Horsemen? Yeah, I think Nebraska's record was 2-1 against those. The year that they were actually given that name by Grantland Rice, Nebraska lost to Notre Dame. But I think the 2 previous years when those guys played, Nebraska defeated them. I think that's the way it was. Red Grange's first game, it's the first game that Red Grange played, and Nebraska was the opponent, and it was played in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. And at the time, the Western Conference, or the Big Ten, the formative Big Ten again, had established what was, it was like a closed circuit type of a deal, whereby they had this huge board. It was about 10 by 15 board, and inside the board was the shape of a football, and inside the football were the lines of a football field. It was lined off as 100 yards. It was called the grid graph or the gridograph. There were several names for it, playograph. And the Western schools used this thing. And what they did is that you'd set this thing up, and it had the names of the players on one team on this side and the names of the players of the other team on this side with their numbers. And they had a series of lights. I've seen pictures of this thing. I'm not exactly sure how it worked, but the lights would indicate player and then where he went on the field. Like, you know, he was at the 10-yard line or whatever. They had lights that did this. And so Nebraska's playing Illinois and in Champaign, and the N Club decided that hey, this might be a good way. We'll get a lot of people to come in and watch this thing. So they contracted with the grid graph people to have one of these things set up in the armory. And I think it was 25 cents that they charged or something like that. And I think they expected 3,000 people to, 2,000, something like that. About 600 showed up. And to watch the Illinois game. And so how they worked it was they through a telegraph, they sent telegraph messages to the armory, and then the guy took the messages to the operator of the grid graph, and the operator punched the lights and got the lights going. And so, the play-by-play didn't occur until it started about an hour after the kickoff or whatever. So or maybe it was even closer to the same time. But that's how they did it. So telegraph operator sends, they got the little memo or note or whatever, takes it to the grid graph operator, and the operator puts up the stuff there, and you see how the game is being going. And again, this board is big. So sometimes the pieces of paper would mount up. You're having a hard time keeping track of it. And apparently, and then after they were used by the grid graph operator, they were taken by carrier to the student radio station, and the radio station redid the game on the radio, recreated it like that. So sometimes they would stack up, and apparently during this game against Illinois, the runner that was taking the notes to the radio station took one out of sequence to the radio station. And the grid graph operator sees Illinois suddenly has more points than he has notes for. So Red Grange runs 70 yards for a touchdown to try to make up this score. And the student newspaper the next day or the next Monday, whenever it came out, said only those fortunate enough to have been at the armory saw this wonderful run by Red Grange, because it didn't happen. So that was the headline, 600C touchdown that didn't happen, but they were fortunate enough to see. So that was Red Grange, and he actually scored, I think, 3 touchdowns in the game, but never on a 70-yard run. So the grid graph, they didn't get nearly enough people to show up for that thing. They said you know, if we don't get a better turnout for the next game, there was Missouri, as that Missouri was the next one they'd use it for, you know, we're gonna have to quit doing this because we can't cover the cost. This is where the confusion comes in. The student yearbook the next year said that it was a raging success, the grid graph. The student newspaper accounts of it were that there were so few people at the Missouri. There were even like fewer people at that one than there had been at the Illinois game, and so that thing just kind of went away. So there was some dispute there on that, but yeah, that was the Red Grange thing. Now Nebraska lost that game, and maybe his senior year Nebraska might have beaten Red Grange. I know the next season Nebraska lost the game but held him to 57 yards, and that was kind of the focus of the, you know, Nebraska had held him to 57 yards. That was great. So the galloping ghost. Good enough. I appreciate your attention, and I usually say if people want to get up and walk out while I'm talking, I don't take offense at that. So I appreciate you not doing that. Thanks.